Hey friends, welcome to another vlog here on my YouTube channel. Recently I was teaching a guitar workshop and a student asked me if I had any advice if he should study music at a conservatoire or music college in order to become a full-time musician. This is quite a difficult one and I'm not sure if I found a good answer in that workshop, but I was thinking a lot about it still on the train home. So in this video I will tell you a little bit about my experience studying guitar, list some reasons why you should or shouldn't pick up studies at a conservatoire, and also mention some challenges I came across at that time that I think are good to be aware of. In case you're new here, my name is Sönke. I'm a guitarist and composer based in Hamburg, Germany. I mainly play concerts and teach workshops, and since the beginning of this year I also produce and upload weekly videos here on my YouTube channel. Let me first tell you a bit about my experience as a music student. I studied acoustic guitar at the Conservatoire in Dresden, Germany, and that course of studies is a bit different than the guitar courses at most other conservatoires, because it's quite open to a lot of different genres, and it also encourages the students to develop their own creative voice on the instrument, to compose and arrange music. You could say that the first half of the studies is still quite similar to conventional classical guitar studies, but later it becomes more and more open and more creative. At most other conservatoires, at least here in Germany, but probably in most countries, you have to decide between classical guitar studies or jazz guitar studies. At the time I started studying guitar in Dresden, I was already writing my own pieces. I played a lot of fingerstyle repertoire and sounded a little bit like a wannabe Tommy Emmanuel without a good timing and with a bit of a strange taste for melodies, but even if I got very good classical lessons as a child, I felt much more at home in the creative fingerstyle approach, and I knew I wanted to develop my own voice and not become a purely classical or jazz player. So for me, Dresden felt like the only option. I applied, and if I wouldn't have gotten accepted, I would have kept music as a hobby, probably studied architecture and tried to become a musician anyway, but luckily that's not how it went. I stayed in Dresden the whole 6 years for my bachelor's and my master's, and in that time my music changed completely. I was lucky to have some really good teachers who helped me bringing together my classical roots with my fingerstyle roots, introduced me to a lot of music I would probably never have played otherwise, and helped me to develop my own style out of all these influences. So the first reason why you should give studying at a conservatoire a try is of course the opportunity to receive lessons from very good musicians. There is a lot of good teaching material out there. All the knowledge is probably even available for free on the internet, but there's nothing like a teacher who can really inspire and challenge you, instantly give feedback, correct your technique, help you choose repertoire that fits your artistic path and support you on your personal journey. The second reason that for me had as much impact as getting lessons from good teachers is studying together with other students who are all great musicians from all kinds of cultural and musical backgrounds. Since my time as a student, I've never been in a place again that offered such diverse musical inspiration. So especially when you're just starting out, all those people around you make it a perfect place to figure out what you connect with musically. Before I went to Dresden, I grew up in a village where there wasn't really anyone I could play together with. So in Dresden, it was actually the first time for me I had different bands and projects, which also improved my playing quite a lot. And obviously, at a conservatoire, it's very easy to connect with other musicians to play with. The third reason is something that can definitely be very different in other countries, but here in Germany you don't have to pay that much for the studies, and the cost of living was actually pretty low. And that meant I didn't have to work many jobs to pay my expenses and had quite a lot of time to work on my music. That is something I only learned to appreciate after I finished my studies and suddenly had to earn a lot more, get my name out there and focus even more on the business side of things. Since my final day of studying, I've never practiced or composed as much again as before, so the time a conservatoire can offer you to work on your art, explore different paths and find your place in the music world is something very valuable. But now let's also talk about some different aspects that I think are good to be aware of if you decide to study music at a conservatoire. I wouldn't call these problems because they might not be a problem for everyone, but they are challenges some students definitely face at some point. Something I discussed with many of my fellow students is that you can't really avoid comparing yourself to the others. This can be a very motivating thing at sometimes, but very often it can also put quite a lot of pressure on you, and sometimes you would make their goals your goals, even if your priorities should be different. It's so important to be aware that it's not possible to be able to do everything you see around you. Everybody has his or her own strengths. One might be a fantastic improviser, the other has an incredible technique, the next one is creating his or her own music and you feel like you could never write anything like it. But it's so important to not make it a competition, but inspire each other and at the same time work on finding a path in music that works for you. I remember that, for example, when I was hanging out with the jazz students, I sometimes got the feeling I also needed to become a great jazz improviser, even if I was not studying jazz, and I knew it would be almost impossible to become as good, while actually focusing on different things that also felt much more like myself. Hearing all the great music when I walked through the hallways motivated me and made me work hard, but also made me have really high expectations for myself I couldn't really measure up to, even if the teachers were quite happy with what I did, and from today's perspective I'm also really satisfied. But at the time as a student I was mostly thinking about the things I couldn't do instead of also seeing the achievements. What I really liked about the school where I went was that these kind of struggles were talked about with the other students and the teachers. And the atmosphere was actually very relaxed and supportive, and you would meet these challenges together. I recently talked with a classical guitar student of a different conservatoire, where competition between the students and pressure was more present, and they wouldn't really talk about it. And that made me feel sad, because at most conservatoires it should be so easy to build a community and make friends to support each other, also because everybody has similar interests and goals. But still, especially in the beginning of my time as a student, where I was suddenly meeting all these skilled musicians and everything seemed to be possible, it was easy to think that everybody around me was doing his or her thing, while I was not sure where everything would go musically. Later I noticed that also many of the other students felt the same, and I started appreciating to not know how my music develops, because that means you stay curious and open to new ideas, and you keep exploring, and that's actually something I don't want to lose. Long story short, if you are a music student, inspire each other, work hard, but don't let all the new possibilities around you put you under too much pressure, because that pressure can take away the fun of being a music student and eventually also the playfulness and the exploratory spirit in your music. Something that made me feel sort of ambivalent in my time as a music student were the guitar exams. They worked well for me as deadlines to finish pieces and prepare repertoires, which helped me to get myself structured and motivated as well. But still, it often felt a little strange that the teachers have to judge a performance you give in a very uninspiring room in the school, and you get a grade for it. For some years I was also on the teacher's side and had to do the same. Maybe someday I will be in that position again. But this was always a big challenge. Judging one performance often only shows a small part of the growth and development in your music that happened over time. In some exams that will of course be taken into account, but it's not always possible. All the teachers I met are obviously aware of this, and everybody does their best to still make these judgments fair, but a grade will stay subjective to a certain degree. I understand grades when it's about proving knowledge, but if it's about a musical performance, it always feels a bit imposed on a situation that can't be judged with just a number or a letter. In general, there are limits where combining this education system of a conservatoire with art and music doesn't work really well, and where it's not always supportive for the student. I don't have good solutions for it, but being aware of it and talking about it helps already, I think. Another thought that comes to mind now is that in the conservatoire I played music only for other musicians. And for most performing musicians that is a bit different from the real world. I already played a lot of concerts as a student and noticed that there is a difference in what is important for the listener regarding the performance and the repertoire, when you play for the music teachers and fellow students, where it's 95% about just the music and how well you play it, compared to playing a concert to a more diverse concert audience, where most audience members join to just have a good time. I have to say, I learned a lot from both of these worlds. In my opinion, it's sometimes a good idea to play less concerts for a while to focus on studying and developing your music. I also did that for almost 2 semesters, but if you aspire to become a performing musician, it might be a good advice to not only study, but get your music out there as soon as possible, play publicly whenever there's an opportunity, because there's so much to be learned by being on a stage with your instrument or your voice that can't be taught in any lesson. Here's another thing I was thinking a lot about recently that students might or might not become aware of about these 2 worlds I mentioned. And I wouldn't call this a fact or anything, it's more a feeling I have. And I'm curious if you can relate to it. Just after I finished studying, I felt that I needed to show a lot of things in my music that I had learned at the Conservatoire. Not because the music needed it, but because my ego wasn't really satisfied otherwise. Now that I didn't have lessons anymore, I would think very often, what would my former teachers think about this or that piece? Sometimes that's also helpful when you are stuck somewhere. But most of the time, it takes away the focus from the music. It's obvious that the question, like, what does music really want, is so much better than asking something like, how can I show my skills? The good thing with music is you will very often show what you have learned anyway, also if you don't zoom in on that and just play. And also in that time I needed to be reminded sometimes that it's fine to play the most simple things in the world if that is what you feel is needed. Especially for musicians who just finished their studies, there can be this trap of playing too much or playing something you don't feel but you have practiced a lot and still want to show. This might apply mostly for musicians who compose or improvise, and it's of course not a problem for everyone. But I have talked to lots of friends and colleagues about this who felt the same in the studies and directly after. And even if it's one of the most basic pieces of advice, I think it's important to remember that complex and simple music have the same value if you feel it. I think sometimes that thought might get lost for some students. I actually think that sometimes the simple pieces are also not too bad for showing that you are a great musician. Okay, let's talk about one more thing that was quite a popular topic between students in my time at the Conservatoire. I was lucky that most of my teachers, from the guitar teachers to the composition, theory and piano teachers, were performing musicians themselves and had a lot of good advice outside of the topic they were actually teaching. In general, that was very helpful, but I also had a few moments, especially with some older teachers who were not performing so much anymore, when I felt that they couldn't really keep up with how the music business developed over the years, and some advice wasn't really up to date. When they were starting their careers, the music industry worked completely different than today. If you start a career now, it's of course important to spend time on social media to promote your music, to learn about streaming, which has a lot of downsides but also some advantages, and it will not disappear in the near future anyway, so we have to find a way to work with it, and you can't ignore it. It's possible that some of the people you spend a lot of time with working on your music have very different perspectives on business-related topics, because it might be not their main focus. The Conservatoire I went to offered a few courses and events about music business. I always try to catch as many of them as possible, and probably at many conservatoires the focus on that already became much bigger since I finished my studies in 2017. But for me, it was always helpful to read a lot about what happened in the music business and check out things for myself. That can be very overwhelming because there are many people on the internet giving out advice, but once I found my 2 or 3 favorite channels, vlogs or newsletters, I would follow them and basically take matters into my own hands. And today I'm very glad I did that. Those were the things that came to mind when I think about my 6 years of being a guitar student and also after teaching and talking to a lot of other music students. But even if I see some challenges here and there, I have to say that for me personally, studying at a conservatoire was very worth it. And I'm sure I would do it again. It feels like the things I knew about guitar playing and music before I started were like puzzle pieces that were put together with many more inspirations and much more knowledge that over time formed something that now feels like my voice on the guitar. I'm not sure if it makes sense, but it feels like my music stands now on quite a stable foundation, and I'm sure no matter which inspirations, ideas and projects will come in the future, I will be confident about my musical vocabulary, and the whole thing will not fall apart but still develop and grow. There is no way I could have learned all of this without the teachers, the fellow students, and the time I had in those years. But on the other hand, I still think I would play music today without having experienced all of this, but just sound very different. One important thing I still want to mention, I have talked about my studies from the perspective of a performing and touring musician. If you aspire to become a music teacher, the degree, your grades and some of the lessons have a much greater importance, and you probably should study music education if you want to have the opportunity to go that route, which is never a bad idea. I was actually surprised how much I also learned about my own playing in the educational lessons, because it was not only about didactic aspects, but in order to explain and show things on the instrument, I basically needed to understand every little muscle movement myself first. But in order to perform, write your own music and express yourself, I feel certain you don't have to study. It would give you some extra opportunities because of the musicians and teachers you meet on the way, but most of my favorite musicians probably never saw a conservatoire from the inside. If you are unsure if you should or shouldn't go to a music school of any kind, I can't and don't want to convince you. It's just one of different possibilities to start your journey as a musician, and I wouldn't know if it fits for you. My only reason I decided to go when I was 19 was that I didn't want to have regrets, to not have at least tried it. My main advice of this whole video is, no matter if you decide to study or not, if you decide to play music, put your heart into it. That's the most important, much more than getting a degree. I hope you enjoyed this video about some of my experiences and thoughts about studying music at a conservatoire. There might be many more things coming to mind in the future, but there's always the option for a part 2 video. If you want to stay up to date about my concerts, please check the tour calendar on my website or add your name to my email list. And if you want to see all the upcoming videos I will upload to this channel, please subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, have a great week and see you on tour or in the next video.